Morning everybody, happy Saturday, and it is day 20 of this daily language diary series. So let's jump into another awesome daily question. Wait a minute, there we go. Did you really think I was gonna forget the first sip of coffee? No, we've been through this before. There's no daily diary series without an amazing cup of coffee. So Nick Weston writes in, when you were learning your first language, how long did it take to feel like your time was paying off? So I think this is a really nice question. I think that as you start learning your first foreign language especially, it's of course natural to wonder, how long is this really going to take? Especially when there are so many programs out there promising fluency in this. I remember my very first language, in fact my very first resource learning a language by myself, was this sort of, I think it was produced by Teach Yourself, and it was this idea of fluency in 6 weeks. And then nowadays there are more and more videos coming out online of people trying to learn a language in 7 days or 10 days. And as many of you will know, on this channel I really try to focus on telling the full story and exactly how it was for me. And so, spoiler alert, I did not learn my first language in 7 days, nor did I learn it in 3 months. So I thought this was a really nice opportunity to not just discuss how long it took me to learn my first language or to feel like all my hard work was paying off, but also to discuss this question of, does it actually get easier? Does it get faster every time you learn a new language? And what are the drawbacks, if any? I love Saturdays. So as some of you will know, I actually struggled immensely with languages when I was a child. So when I was in school, I was learning French in secondary school back in the UK, and I was so bad that my teacher told me I would never speak a second language. It was so hard for me, and I just was so confused. I remember that I just couldn't understand the concept of conjugations in French, and nobody ever really made a strong effort to properly explain it to me. I was just always told that I wasn't really good at school. I was good at sports, and so I just assumed that languages were never gonna be a thing that I would excel at. So fast forwarding to when I was 16 years old, I truly have no idea why this happened. Most things in my life, I can sort of trace back the origin to why I became interested in something, but languages is the only one where I really have absolutely no idea. I just know that one day I was 16 years old and I decided I wanted to learn Spanish. And I remember asking my mum if she could get me just any kind of Spanish book or a resource. I just wanted to learn Spanish. And so she went out and got me this sort of 6 weeks to fluency in Spanish. It was like every chapter was a man on an airplane and he was like talking to the lady next to him. And I suppose in theory, she teaches him fluent Spanish by the time they land in Spain. And I remember going through this and I really enjoyed it. And then I also later managed to get some access through the library to a copy of the Rosetta Stone. And I just remember how much fun it was to just copy those sounds and those sentences. The first time that I really felt like maybe I can actually do this was when I realized I was actually very good at copying the Spanish sentences that I was hearing on the Rosetta Stone. I remember it was things like El hombre está corriendo. And I would just say this over and over again. I remember the sentence el caballo está comiendo una zanahoria. The horse is eating a carrot. And then I would go into school. I was still in the UK at the time, so I was in sixth form. And I don't even remember how this happened or how I managed to squeeze it into a conversation, but I would say these sentences and people thought I was fluent in Spanish. Because again, even though I hadn't really developed a huge amount of language knowledge yet, I had developed this ability to repeat those sentences quite convincingly. So I think there was a certain feeling of, oh, this is paying off quite early on when learning my first foreign language, which was Spanish. But I don't really think this is quite the feeling that Nick is talking about in his question. Spanish for me was an interesting one because then I moved to the United States to play basketball for a high school here. And then for the first time, I found myself in a position where I had lots of people I could practice Spanish with. In particular, there were lots of people whose families were from Mexico and also El Salvador. And I remember over the next 18 months before I graduated high school in the US, I did develop the ability to really start having conversations in Spanish. But I remember that my listening skill was always really bad. So I could sound very fluid and fluent when I spoke, but I had a lot of trouble understanding people. So what I really want to talk about more is when I went to learn Japanese, because when I was in college, I had decided that I wanted to teach myself Japanese and I wanted to go and study abroad and live in Japan. And I remember at this time, I still didn't really feel like I was good at learning languages. I felt like I had managed to do it with Spanish to a degree. I certainly didn't feel fluent yet. I distinctly remember thinking to myself, you know what? When it comes to sports, I have always just worked really hard. And there's always just been this direct correlation between me working like crazy and getting really good at those sports. And for some reason, that was the first time in my life that I had actually made a connection between something intellectual or academic and this sort of simple formula I'd always used to get good at sports, which was just work really hard. So I think that's a whole different story really, but the point here is that with Japanese, that was the first time I really started learning a language very seriously as an adult, and I went all the way from sort of zero to being very fluent and working as an interpreter in Japan, going to university in Japan, working as a barista in Japan, and then teaching Japanese after that for a number of years. I would say with Japanese, it was similar in that there was a initial feeling that this is all really working and a sort of really nice feeling of time was paying off fairly early on, because in Japanese, the pronunciation is quite easy and I started to be able to say simple sentences. But to be honest with you, it took a very long time after that. And I remember it had to be at least, to be honest, 1 year, maybe 1.5 years before it really did start to feel like this is starting to pay off. But I think honestly, it was probably about 2 years with Japanese before I actually really started to be able to speak and to where things really started coming together. And I think that's probably when I actually felt this is paying off. This is really working. And that was when I decided that I wanted to be fluent in Japanese before going to study abroad there. And actually my first day in Japan, I was working as an interpreter for a private client from the US. Now, on to the question of, does it get easier with every language? Now, this is a bit subjective and it depends, right? Because in my case, I went from Japanese to French. And so of course, as a native speaker of English, learning French feels a lot simpler and easier than learning a language like Japanese. But I have to say, when I learned French, it was a lot faster. You can actually see on this channel, if you go back and watch my documentary about my life in Japan, there's a portion where I speak French after just learning for a few months, and I am actually able to like somewhat express myself, and I had to practice a little bit and figure out what I was gonna say. But then the next video on this channel was me like maybe 6 months later, and I was actually speaking pretty darn fluently in French, and I was talking about how I was watching nature documentaries in French, and I made a whole video about achieving native-like vocabulary and abilities in a foreign language without actually living there. So I think with French, it probably took about 4 to 5 months, and then all of a sudden, I really started to see the payoff, and it wasn't long before I was speaking pretty darn fluently, and after that, it was just off to the races. Now, if I move forward to when I started learning German, for example, German was the fastest I ever acquired foreign language skills. I was living in Portugal at the time, and I was in a pretty desperate situation, and I had decided I wanted to move to Germany, and I really was quite desperate. And so within 6 weeks, I went from not being able to speak German at all to actually moving to Germany and able to get around with bad German. I remember I set my first phone contract up in German. I did everything I could in German. It was hard and I made lots of mistakes. I doubt it was terribly eloquent German, but in 6 weeks, I managed to do that. Now, this is not me trying to show off. This is not one of those watch me learn a language in 7 days type thing. That was a real life scenario where I had a very desperate need in my mind to learn that language. But there is no question that I was definitely able to rely on both my experience learning lots of languages up to that point, and I had also spent time learning Dutch. Of course, I'm an English speaker, so I was also able to rely on related languages that I had learned previously. So in summary, how long did it take me to start feeling like my time was paying off with my first language or two? I would say I noticed a pattern where quite early, it felt like very exciting and exhilarating and like, wow, this is paying off. You know, I'm able to repeat some sentences, I'm able to sound pretty good, people seem to be impressed when I say things. But then that was followed by quite a long period of sort of feeling like maybe this is not working so well, or why is this taking so long? The natural question of, will I ever be able to speak this language fluently? And so with Japanese, I think it took me about 18 months to almost maybe 2 years before I really felt like I was getting the hang of it. And then to answer that broader question that I brought up of, does it get faster and easier with every new language you learn? I do think to a point, yes, it certainly gets easier. Now, when people talk about this, I think a lot of learners assume this is purely cognitive. This means that your brain is just getting better at it and you're just getting faster at learning on the whole. I do think that is part of the story, but what lots of people forget is that some of the largest gains you get in speed when learning new languages is that you simply figure out what works for you. You figure out how you like to learn, and you also just get the confidence to know that, okay, I will trust the process. I think one of the biggest gains you get from learning multiple languages is you become very comfortable with the ambiguity of how long this will take, and you become comfortable trusting the process because you know that you can do this. Okay, Nick, I hope that helps you. I hope you found the response interesting. As I keep saying in recent videos, I do think it's really important for us to keep having these really honest conversations as language learners and polyglots to really tell the full story. And so I'm happy to admit that yes, it took me a couple years to start feeling like Japanese was paying off for me. And I'm also happy to admit that the fastest experiences I had learning languages, they were absolutely thanks to my experience with language learning, but also related languages. And so nobody should feel bad if you don't learn German in 6 weeks. I think it's really important for us to help people learning languages to have realistic expectations for themselves and not make people feel like they're failing if they don't learn as fast as somebody else. Okay, with that, I wish you all a wonderful Saturday, and I'll see you back here for day 21 of the Daily Language Diary series.